Welcome to Demon Sleep. I'm here to help you unwind tonight. If you enjoy this space, feel free to like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It makes this feel like a shared night across the world. These stories are different and I'm glad you're here. Dim the lights, let the room settle, and let's begin. Story 1, The Mercy. 5 years had passed in that house, long enough for routines to form, yet somehow never long enough for it to feel like his. The place had been her decision, a low, sun-baked ranch with pale walls and a stubborn front door that swelled in the damp air, demanding a precise lift-hand push motion. Helen had known it instinctively. She moved through that door as if it recognized her, as if wood and hinge had learned her hands. Martin never did. He understood now that he had always been blind to those quiet details. And standing alone in the thick hush of his second Christmas Eve without her, that truth pressed heavier than grief itself. The neighborhood had warned him once, though warning might be too generous a word. It came casually, wrapped in politeness. Carol Pfeiffer, 3 houses down, mentioned it while reclaiming a casserole dish. Her tone had been careful, measured, the way people speak when they sense a tradition might sound absurd if explained too plainly. If the doorbell rings twice after midnight on Christmas Eve, she'd said, don't open it. Just an old custom. The older families still minded. Martin had smiled and nodded, filing it away with other harmless oddities, like lawn statues no one touched or porch lights left burning all night. He assumed it was about pranksters, or bored teenagers, or carolers who'd had too much cider. One of those rituals that linger in old neighborhoods long after anyone remembers why. He forgot about it completely. Until last year. Helen had been gone 3 months when the sound came. Sharp, clean, unmistakable. 2 rings, not rushed, not tentative. Perfectly spaced, like someone who knew exactly how long to wait between them. The clock on his nightstand glowed 12:47 a.m. Sleep had already abandoned him by then. Since her death, rest arrived in fragments, leaving him stranded between dreams and waking. The bell pulled him fully into the room. He lay still, heart ticking louder than the seconds. He waited for footsteps, for laughter, for the engine of a car pulling away. Nothing came. The silence afterward felt deliberate, heavy, as if whoever stood outside hadn't left but had instead leaned closer, listening back. Martin pulled the quilt up to his chin and did nothing. Carol Pfeiffer's careful voice floated up from memory, and he stayed frozen until the feeling, whatever it was, slowly thinned and released him. By morning, the porch was untouched. No footprints in the dew, no pamphlets, no signs of life at all. He mentioned it later to George Latimer by the mailbox, forcing a laugh into his voice. George didn't smile. He simply nodded once. Good, he said. Good you remember. Now it was Christmas Eve again. The house felt smaller this year, as if grief had finally settled into the walls. Martin sat alone in the living room, the tree lit but undecorated. He hadn't found the energy for ornaments. Midnight crept closer, minute by minute, and though he told himself he was being foolish, his eyes kept drifting toward the front door. At 12:47, the bell rang. Twice. The sound cut through him sharper than before. His chest tightened. He stood without meaning to, legs moving on their own, carrying him across the room. The air felt wrong, too still, too expectant. He reached the door and stopped, inches away, close enough to feel the cold seeping through the wood. A thought came unbidden, soft and dangerous. What if this time is different? What if mercy only knocks once a year? His hand hovered over the handle. The memory of Helen opening this door, effortless, knowing, flashed through him. He imagined her voice, calm, steady, telling him to pay attention to the small things. Outside, something shifted. Not footsteps, not breath, just the sense of patience wearing thin. Martin stepped back. The bell did not ring again. In the morning, the porch would be empty. The neighbors would nod, and the tradition would hold, quiet and intact. Martin would remain alive, alone and spared, carrying the strange, unsettling comfort of knowing that sometimes survival depends not on bravery but on restraint. And sometimes mercy is what stays outside when you refuse to open the door. Martin found himself turning the custom over in his mind again, not because he believed something would happen, but because focusing on quiet puzzles was safer than revisiting Helen's final days. From what he'd gathered, the late-night ringing wasn't something that repeated. One visit per home, whispered about but never explained. That was fine. Mysteries with rules were easier to live with than memories without mercy. The nurse had been gentle. Everyone had been gentle. They spoke in the same careful phrases, assuring him she hadn't suffered as much as it looked, that the medication had eased her, that nothing more could have been done. Helen herself had rarely complained. She'd endured with a calm that now felt unbearable to remember. He stood at the kitchen sink, scrubbing a single plate as if it were precious. The room stretched too wide around him. Helen had loved this space, had animated it with intention. Dough rising under cloth, pots murmuring on the stove, the quiet rhythm of preparation. Now the long counters felt like an accusation, all that empty surface bearing witness to what was gone. He dried the plate and slid it into the cabinet where it rested alone. Once, that shelf had been full. He'd given the rest away months ago. Complete sets, dishes, chairs, even thoughts had become something he could no longer tolerate. The clock above the stove glowed 11:38. There was no real reason to stay awake, but rest felt impossible regardless. He brewed chamomile, following Helen's old advice even though it had never helped him, and carried the mug into the living room. The tree stood where it always had. Putting it up had felt automatic or maybe stubborn. The ornaments were all hers. A carved nutcracker from a cold New England trip, a fragile glass bird that scattered light, a child's lopsided handprint from a nephew who now had a family of his own. He hung each one with care, avoiding the memory of her voice recounting their origins every December, as if the stories themselves kept them alive. The house murmured around him. The air unit clicked awake. The refrigerator breathed softly. Upstairs, a familiar groan in the floorboards mimicked footsteps, a sound that had fooled him more times than he could count. Over time, he'd learned the difference between the house speaking and something that demanded response. Homes, he realized, were never silent. They expanded, contracted, whispered to themselves endlessly, carrying on the quiet labor of being. At 11:52, another sound slipped through that background chorus. It was faint, almost ignorable, the small, precise click of a latch being released. It came from the rear of the house, from the kitchen. Martin didn't move. The mug rested in his hands, steam thinning into the air as he listened with every part of himself. Nothing followed, no door opening, no hinge complaining, no rush of night air or measured step on tile. Just that single sound. It could have been anything, he told himself. Wood settling, water dripping, a trick of memory shaped by loneliness. Still, the house seemed to hold its breath. He placed the mug down and stood, drifting through the dining room with deliberate softness, though he couldn't have explained why he felt the need to move quietly. The instinct rose uninvited, old and animal, as if sound itself might attract notice. The kitchen looked unchanged. The counters were bare. The dish towel lay neatly folded where he'd left it. The small stove lamp spilled its weak circle of light across familiar surfaces. Everything appeared orderly, except the back door. It wasn't wide open. It didn't gape or announce itself. It rested slightly ajar, just enough to carve a narrow column of absolute darkness between door and frame. 6 inches, maybe less. Enough. Warm air slipped inside through the opening, thick with the breath of night. Wet soil, distant salt, the lush sweetness of jasmine blooming somewhere unseen. Martin stood frozen, his thoughts lining up excuses as if rehearsed. He must have closed it poorly earlier. The latch had always been unreliable. Helen used to mention it, said the frame was subtly warped, that it never quite caught the way it should. But he hadn't taken the trash out that evening, and he knew in a way that left no room for debate, that the door had been shut and locked when he'd finished at the sink. He checked it every night, always. It was part of the ritual he'd built to convince himself the house could still be trusted. He stepped forward and pulled the door fully open. The yard lay still beyond it. The motion light should have flared to life, but it didn't. Another quiet wrongness. In the dim glow spilling from the kitchen, he could make out the skeletal maple, the sagging fence, the shed leaning slightly off its hinges. All familiar, all mundane. The grass bore no impressions. Nothing stirred. Martin closed the door with care, slid the bolt into place, then checked it again. His hand lingered on the cool metal longer than necessary, as if reassurance might seep through by contact alone. The clock above the stove read 12:03. Past midnight now, officially Christmas Day, yet it felt detached from time altogether, an hour unclaimed by celebration or routine, hanging between states. The doorbell rang at 12:19. Twice. The sound seemed distant despite coming from his own porch, as though it had traveled a long way to reach him. Martin hadn't moved from the kitchen. He didn't startle. He didn't approach the door. That rule had been learned. Instead, he counted his pulse in the silence that followed, marking the space between breaths. Outside, something waited. He felt it not as a sound or movement, but as pressure, like eyes resting on skin without ever being seen. A minute passed, then another. Last year, whatever lingered beyond the door had retreated after a short while, leaving only memory behind. This time it stayed. The waiting stretched until it felt intentional. At 12:27, the quiet changed, not shattered, not disturbed, but altered. The air itself seemed to shift, as if attention had been redirected. Martin sensed it before he understood it. Whatever had been lingering at the front of the house was no longer there. Then came the faintest sound. A soft scrape, rubber against concrete, slow, deliberate steps sliding along the side of the house. Toward the back, toward the door he had found ajar. His lungs locked. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides, checked the deadbolt again, then retreated to a spot where he could see both exits, the back door and the dark hallway leading deeper into the house. The footsteps stopped. Silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It pressed in on him, dense and purposeful. Someone stood just beyond the back door. He knew it without sight or sound, the way one knows when another body is too close in a dark room. The wood between them felt thin, inadequate. Heat seemed to radiate through it. They waited. So did he. The clock crept forward, each second loud enough to bruise. At some point, he couldn't say when, his hand drifted to the knife block. He pulled free the large kitchen knife Helen had always insisted be kept sharp. Its weight steadied him, though the idea of using it felt absurd. Against who? For what reason? This was his street, his neighbors. This had to be confusion, a mistake, something ordinary wearing the mask of threat. At 12:31, the steps resumed. They moved away from the back door, unhurried, circling the house with the same calm assurance as before. A moment later, an engine turned over somewhere down the road. Not nearby, not rushed. The car rolled off, its sound thinning until it disappeared entirely. The night reset itself, as if nothing unusual had occurred. But something had. The door had been tested, the front first, then the back. Whoever it was hadn't wanted entry, not exactly. They'd wanted confirmation, proof that he was inside, that he was awake, that he had chosen not to answer. Martin remained in the kitchen long after the house went still again, the knife heavy in his hand. He didn't lower it until the clock read 1:15, until his arm burned and his legs trembled with exhaustion. Only then did he move, checking every lock, every window, every threshold, as if repetition might erase what had already happened. In the living room, his tea sat untouched, its surface dark and cold, reflecting the colored lights of the tree. He didn't go to bed. Instead, he sank into Helen's chair, still hers in his mind, and kept watch as the hours dragged forward. He stared at the windows until the sky slowly diluted from black to gray. Morning brought no evidence, no marks in the sand, no disturbed grass. Wrapped in his robe, he circled the house, inventing explanations as he went. The soil was too loose to hold footprints. Whoever it was had stuck to the concrete, or none of it had happened at all, just a mind fraying under grief and sleeplessness. That explanation almost held. Almost, except the back door, which he found unlocked. Open, that part was undeniable. No grief-softened memory, no trick of exhaustion. The door had been open, and that fact refused to bend. Christmas Day drifted by in a strange stillness, the kind reserved for holidays spent alone. Martin heated a boxed meal that promised celebration and consumed it without registering flavor. His daughter called from across the country, her voice bright with practiced warmth. He told her he was fine. The weather was pleasant. The tree was up. Yes, he was looking after himself. Each lie arrived smoothly, already formed. There was no reason to burden her with half explanations, unprovable fears about doors, movement, and sensations that vanished the moment you tried to describe them. She had a life full of noise and color. He would not darken it. The next afternoon, Carol Pfeiffer knocked. She stood on his porch holding a plate of cookies, just as she had many times before. That alone meant nothing. Carol baked the way some people breath, but her face carried a careful tension this time, a look that suggested purpose rather than kindness. When Martin invited her in, she declined with a soft smile. Too busy, she said. Always so much to handle after the holidays. She passed him the plate and didn't let go right away. Instead, she looked at him, really looked, and said she'd noticed he hadn't answered the doorbell on Christmas Eve. That was good, she told him. Very good. It meant he remembered. Some people forgot. Some decided traditions were optional. Others let curiosity get the better of them. But this one mattered. Martin said he recalled her mentioning it once. Carol nodded, hands folding neatly at her waist as though following steps long practiced. It always sounded foolish until you understood, she said. The families who'd been there the longest knew, the Latimers, the Dwyers, the Hoffmans. They passed it along. It was about looking out for one another, about keeping things the way they were meant to be. Martin nodded back, unsure what agreement was being asked of him. Carol smiled. It was a polite expression, restrained, never quite reaching her eyes. She told him they were glad he lived there, that Helen had always been involved, always present. They'd all worried when she fell ill. She touched his arm briefly, the gesture gentle but oddly formal, and reminded him that if he ever needed anything, help was close by. Then she was gone. She walked briskly down the sidewalk under the bright, cool sky, leaving Martin standing with the cookies balanced in his hands. As she reached her house, he noticed George Latimer across the way, paused at the edge of his driveway, watching. George lifted a hand. Martin returned the gesture without thinking. He went back inside and locked the door. The cookies remained on the counter for 3 days. He didn't touch them. He couldn't explain why. They looked fine, smelled fine. Eventually, he threw them away uneaten. Even then, the unease stayed. Quiet, persistent, like a door that never quite closed. Carol's cookies had always been flawless, but after that visit they carried the weight of her words. The unease clung to them, invisible but persistent, until the idea of eating even one felt wrong. Some associations, once formed, could not be undone. The days after Christmas slipped by with an unnatural stillness. They didn't belong to the year ending or the one waiting ahead. Time felt softened, negotiable, as if the rules had loosened. In that slackened space, Martin began to notice things he once would have dismissed. Mrs. Dwyer across the street always seemed to be at her window when he stepped out for the mail. The Hoffmans' teenage boy crossed to the opposite sidewalk rather than pass in front of Martin's house. Carol waved when she drove by, but the gesture felt measured, almost ceremonial, less a greeting than a confirmation that he was still there. He told himself he was imagining it. Loss did this. It rearranged perception, connected dots that were never meant to touch. Helen had been his gravity. With her gone, he felt untethered, drifting. The neighborhood that had once felt welcoming now seemed faintly foreign, as if everyone else shared an understanding he'd never been taught. On December 28th, he found the photograph. He'd been searching for Helen's death certificate, another document demanded by an insurance company that refused to resolve anything without repetition and delay. The hospice had handed him a thick folder weeks ago, and he tucked it away somewhere during that blurred stretch when days barely registered. Now he couldn't remember where. After exhausting the house, he turned to the garage. The storage boxes, Helen's papers, the things he'd avoided touching because touching them meant admitting she was truly gone. The photo appeared in the second box, slipped inside a holiday card from the Latimers, dated 2 Christmases ago, before the illness. It showed Helen sitting in their living room, smiling toward the camera. She looked tired but content. At first glance, it was ordinary. Then he noticed the angle. The picture had been taken from the narrow space between the hallway and the living room. Martin knew that spot well, and knew he had never stood there to take photos. When they took pictures, they did it together, seated side by side, facing forward, his arm around her. This image wasn't like that. It was candid, or meant to appear so. Helen was aware of the camera, but pretending not to be. Her smile was just slightly off. Her shoulders held a tension that didn't belong in a casual moment. In the bottom corner, there was writing. Martin turned the photo over. Scrawled across the back, in handwriting he did not recognize, were 4 words. After next Christmas. He sank onto the concrete floor, the chill seeping through his clothes. His heart began to beat in a pattern he didn't recognize, too fast, then too slow, as if unsure which rhythm to follow. Someone had been standing in his house. Not breaking in, not hiding. Waiting. His home 2 years earlier. Someone had stood inside these walls, aimed a camera at Helen, and marked the moment with words that hinted at sequence. Not a memory, a schedule. He studied the card again. A generic holiday message from George and Nancy Latimer. Cheerful, forgettable, yet it hadn't been pinned to the corkboard with the others that year. It had been tucked away among Helen's most private papers. Hidden. Why would she hide a neighbor's card? Martin carried the photograph back into the house and stood in the living room, trying to reconstruct that Christmas. Helen had been healthy then, laughing. They'd gone to the Hoffmans' party, drank too much spiced punch, endured George Latimer's jokes with good humor. Nothing had seemed out of place. Except afterward. The memory surfaced slowly. Helen had grown quiet that night, gone to bed early, claimed a headache, and not long after January maybe, she casually mentioned the idea of moving. No urgency, just a thought, wanting something different. Martin had brushed it off. They lived there 9 years. They just remodeled the kitchen. The suggestion had felt impractical, even silly. Helen hadn't argued, she'd simply let it drop. She'd never brought it up again. Now the house felt altered, as if awareness itself had shifted its shape. Corners no longer felt empty. Shadows seemed purposeful. Martin walked room to room, stopping, turning, imagining where someone could stand unseen, where eyes could rest unnoticed. The dining room window lined up with the Dwyers. The bedroom faced the Hoffmans. The kitchen window looked straight into Carol Pfeiffer's yard. Sightlines. Connections. No, he stopped himself. This was grief distorting reality. The photo meant nothing. Helen could have taken it herself. A timer. An experiment. The writing on the back might have been unrelated. He was inventing menace where there was only loss, recasting friendly neighbors as quiet conspirators. But the back door had been opened. That fact refused to dissolve. New Year's Eve arrived, and once again Martin found himself awake as midnight approached. The air carried that same expectant weight, the sense of something advancing without sound. No bell rang, no knock came. At 12:47, he checked the clock. The same minute as before. A low engine hum drifted in from the street. Martin eased toward the window, careful not to disturb the curtain, and peered out. A dark sedan sat parked 3 houses down, its lights off, its presence patient. He couldn't see the exhaust in the mild air, but he knew it was running. The car didn't move. It didn't need to. It was already where it was meant to be. The warm darkness. Someone sat behind the wheel, perfectly still, facing Martin's home. 10 minutes passed. Then the car eased forward and disappeared down the street. Martin stayed where he was long after until his calves ached and the sky began to pale at the edges. That morning, he called his daughter. He told her he was thinking about selling the house, about moving closer to her. The idea startled her. He'd always been firm about standing on his own, but she recovered quickly, enthusiasm rushing in to fill the pause. She said it would be wonderful. They'd help him find somewhere comfortable. The relief in her voice told him more than her words ever could. She'd been worrying, wondering if he was holding together or slowly coming apart in that oversized house saturated with memory. He didn't mention the photograph, or the unlocked door, or the car. Those things resisted explanation. They weren't events so much as a pattern, an atmosphere, a collection of small wrongnesses that sounded unreasonable once spoken aloud, even to him. January arrived, and Martin began preparing the house for sale. The realtor came highly recommended. Carol Pfeiffer delivered the suggestion herself, leaning over the fence with that same polished smile. She arrived a few days later to assess the property, moving through the rooms with practiced efficiency. She pointed out cosmetic updates, fresh paint, minor repairs. The back door latch, she noted, was unreliable. Anyone could open it with the right pressure. Old hardware, probably worn down over time, easy to fix. Martin hired a locksmith that afternoon. He watched as new metal replaced old, solid, weighty vinyl, the kind of lock that resisted casual hands. The locksmith was local, had lived nearby for decades, and as he worked, he mentioned recognizing the house. Someone he knew had lived there years ago, back when the Carmichells owned it. They'd left abruptly, he said. Family emergency. The place sat empty for 2 years afterward before the next owners moved in. The locksmith mused that some houses seemed to cycle people through while others held on tight. This one, he added, had seen 5 families in 40 years. That was a lot for a quiet, established neighborhood. Martin hadn't known that. He'd never thought to look into the house's past. 5 families, 40 years. An average of 8 years each. That felt brief for a place where people talked about roots and tradition. He mentioned as much, keeping his voice neutral. The locksmith shrugged. Sometimes a house didn't fit, he said. Sometimes a neighborhood didn't either. Everyone had their reasons for leaving. He finished tightening the last screw, tested the lock, and nodded with satisfaction. Martin watched him go, standing alone in the kitchen, and wondered, quietly, carefully, whether leaving was ever really a choice. Moving on. After the locksmith drove away, Martin found himself back in the garage, kneeling beside the same boxes he'd opened days earlier. He pulled out the folder from when they'd bought the house and began reading with the focus of someone looking for something he didn't yet know how to name. The disclosures were unremarkable. Roof replaced, wiring updated. Nothing flagged as a concern, but tucked at the back was a single page he didn't remember reading before, a short letter from the previous owners, written neatly, politely. It included a forwarding address in Arizona and an offer to answer any questions. Best wishes in your new home. The date caught his attention. March 15th. They'd closed in April, barely a month later. No drawn-out negotiations, no delays. He remembered how eager the sellers had seemed, how quickly they'd agreed to terms, how much they'd left behind, furniture, boxes, things people normally don't abandon. At the time, Helen had been delighted. Practical, free furniture was useful. Now standing alone, Martin felt a chill settle into place. Who leaves a perfectly good dining table? People in a hurry, he thought. People trying to get away. He dialed the Arizona number, fully expecting it to be disconnected after more than a decade. It rang. Then, unexpectedly, someone answered. A woman's voice, guarded, asking who was calling. Martin explained, gave his name, told her he lived in their old house on Oleander Drive and had a few questions about its history. The silence that followed stretched long enough that he wondered if the line had gone dead. Then she asked a question of her own. Are you alone in that house? Martin said his wife had passed away. Another pause. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, threaded with something like pity. She said she was sorry, truly sorry, and then she told him he should sell the house, that he shouldn't spend another winter there. Martin asked why. Her answer came without hesitation. She couldn't explain, wouldn't, but she urged him to leave. They'd convinced themselves, she said, that what happened to them was personal, that maybe they were the problem, but if he was calling now, asking questions, then maybe it was. Maybe it was the place, or the people around it. Martin asked what she meant by what happened. Her reply was precise, almost rehearsed. Sell the house, move somewhere else, somewhere new, somewhere without history, somewhere people don't know each other too well. Did he understand? Martin said yes, though he didn't. The line went dead. He tried calling back. No answer. Over the next 3 days, he called 17 more times, morning, afternoon, night. The phone rang endlessly. No one ever picked up again. The listing went live in mid-January. The realtor was confident. The house had good structure. The neighborhood was desirable. The price was right. Multiple showings were booked for the first weekend. Martin cleaned with obsessive care. He erased evidence of loneliness, arranged rooms to suggest warmth and belonging, staged a life that looked settled and safe. He worked late into the nights, polishing surfaces, straightening frames, rehearsing a version of the house that did not watch back. Because if someone new walked through these rooms, smiled, and decided to stay, he wasn't sure what that would mean. Only that he could not be here when they did. A place that only needed someone new to step into it. Martin stripped the rooms of anything personal. Helen's photograph came down from the mantel. The ornaments disappeared into boxes. The house became neutral, staged, almost anonymous, like a model home meant to suggest life without ever containing it. The first showing was scheduled for Saturday morning at 11. Martin left early, drove to a cafe, and waited with his hands wrapped around a cooling mug. At 11:45, the realtor called. Her voice was professional, carefully even. The couple liked the house, she said, but they wanted to see more options. Nothing wrong, just keeping their choices open. The second showing ended the same way. So did the third. By Monday, no new appointments appeared. Tuesday brought a suggestion to lower the price. By Wednesday, the realtor was talking about market timing and seasonal hesitation, asking if he'd considered updating the kitchen first. Martin sat in the darkened living room that night and understood, with a certainty that felt almost merciful, that the house was not going to sell. Not like this. Not to anyone she brought. The neighborhood wouldn't permit it. Buyers would be nudged away, politely, subtly, or they'd feel the same quiet resistance that had made the woman in Arizona plead with him to leave. The listing would linger until he either surrendered or dropped the price so low that only the desperate would look twice. And desperation, he realized, could be managed. Those buyers would be evaluated by Carol, by George, by families who knew how to decide who belonged and who didn't. People who valued neighbors who watched out for one another, who believed in small, necessary mercies, who understood that community sometimes demanded hard choices, carried out gently. His thoughts drifted to Helen's final weeks. The nurse had been so kind. Everyone had been kind. Meals delivered, offers to help, reassurances whispered with practiced calm. Carol had arranged the hospice care herself, recommended the nurse by name, said she was trusted, experienced, that she'd helped many families nearby through the same thing, knew how to ease pain, knew when enough was enough. Helen had been suffering. The cancer had advanced quickly. The prognosis had never been hopeful. Everyone agreed her pain was significant. Everyone agreed something had to be done. Martin went back to the storage boxes once more, hands trembling as he pulled out the hospice records he'd avoided reading too closely. He reviewed the medication logs. Morphine administered on schedule, dosages precise, notes neat. Everything appeared correct. Everything appeared compassionate. He sat there for a long time, paperwork spread around him, and finally understood what the tradition was for. Not to keep something out, but to make sure the right people stayed in, and that those who were ready, truly ready, were helped along with care, discretion, and a silence the neighborhood knew how to keep. Everything would have looked ordinary, if not for the handwriting. In the margin of one hospice record, pressed between dosage notes and timestamps, was a short line written by someone else, someone Martin did not recognize. Community recommendation confirmed. The words sat there casually, as if they belonged. His pulse thudded in his ears as he turned another page. Tucked between insurance forms was a photocopied document so plain it almost escaped notice. No letterhead, no logo, just a title centered at the top in unremarkable type. Compassionate care assessment. Below it, 2 columns of names. He knew every one of them. The Latimers, the Dwyers, the Hoffmans, Carol Pfeiffer. Others, neighbors who had shared meals, exchanged smiles, spoken softly during Helen's illness. At the bottom of the page, a single box was marked. Intervention recommended, unanimous. Dated 3 weeks before Helen died. Martin's hands began to shake. The air felt too thick to breathe, heavy with sweetness and decay. He stood slowly, needing to anchor himself in something familiar. But the house was no longer familiar. The kitchen became the place where medications had been prepared with practiced care. The bedroom became the room where Helen, in one of her last lucid moments, had said she was tired, so tired, but didn't want to give up. The living room became the space where Carol had sat beside her, reading aloud in a gentle voice, while Martin ran errands that now felt orchestrated. They hadn't killed her with force. They'd done it gently. Incremental adjustments, a little more comfort, a little less resistance, a kindness calibrated so precisely that stopping her heart became inevitable. Mercy. They had decided she was suffering too much. And now they had decided the same about him. The double ring wasn't a superstition. It wasn't about intruders or pranks or folklore. It was a signal, a designation. The committee had convened. They had discussed his isolation, his grief, the way he drifted through days without anchor. A widower alone in a house too large for one person. A man quietly unraveling. Christmas Eve had been an evaluation. Would he answer? Was he alone? Was intervention necessary yet? When he hadn't come to the door, they checked the back, confirmed access, confirmed logistics. They were giving him time. That was the kindness Carol had spoken of. That was what she meant by respecting tradition, by being glad he was part of the neighborhood. Grace, a waiting period to see if he recovered, if he found a reason to remain, if he decided to leave. But he hadn't recovered. He had tried to sell. And that, Martin now understood with chilling clarity, was not permitted. The house would never sell because they would not allow it to sell. Every showing would be quietly dismantled, every buyer gently redirected. Only the right kind of people were ever allowed to stay. And Martin was no longer the right kind. The mercy that had ended Helen's suffering was already circling back for him. Patient, organized, unanimous. They would discourage every buyer until Martin stopped resisting and accepted what was being offered. Community, care, mercy. He thought about calling the police, but the thought collapsed under its own weight. What would he say? that his neighbors had murdered his wife by being too kind, that they had filled out paperwork he was never meant to find, that he felt watched, evaluated, quietly threatened. There was no crime that could be named. The hospice nurse's records would show everything done by the book, the medications logged, the doses reasonable. The committee document would be framed as a support group, a prayer circle, a compassionate misunderstanding. And Martin, widower, grieving, isolated, would sound unstable. The police would nod sympathetically, suggest counseling, recommend a doctor, a local doctor, one who would already know. That was what established neighborhoods meant, not friendliness, familiarity, consensus, everyone knowing everyone else's business and agreeing on what was acceptable and what required intervention. Martin packed a bag that night. Clothes, important papers, Helen's photograph from the mantel. He didn't overthink it. He didn't hesitate. He would leave the house behind. The money didn't matter. None of it mattered if he stayed alive. He planned to drive to Oregon. His daughter would take him in. He would explain later. He would figure things out later. At 3:00 a.m., he carried the bag to the car, moving carefully, quietly. That was when the headlights appeared. A single car rolled slowly down Oleander Drive. No rush, just watching. It passed his house, reached the end of the street, turned around, and came back. It stopped 3 houses down and idled. Martin froze, his hand still on the car door. Another set of headlights emerged from the opposite direction and parked 2 houses up. Then a third car pulled into Carol Pfeiffer's driveway. Lights came on across the street, not harsh, not alarming, just lamps, soft domestic glows. Living room lights turned on by people who had already been awake, people who had been waiting. Martin understood then that leaving was no longer an option. Not now, not while they were watching. They would follow him, or stop him, or simply make sure he never made it far. He carried the bag back inside, left it by the door, locked the house, and stood alone in his dark kitchen. There was no escape. The neighborhood had made its decision. They were only allowing him time to accept it with dignity. February came with heavy storms that tore through the county, knocking out power for miles. Houses went dark, streets fell quiet. Martin's lights stayed on. 3 houses on Oleander Drive lost electricity. His did not. The furnace ran. The refrigerator hummed. The lamps glowed steadily through the night. It was statistically improbable and deeply reassuring. Someone was looking after him. When the storm worsened, Carol knocked on his door with Sue, smiling gently, saying how lucky he was, how fortunate, how the house must be on a better line. Martin thanked her. He always thanked them now, because gratitude was expected, and patience, he understood, was running out. Frequent George lingering longer on his evening walks, the quiet coordination that settled over the street like a held breath. The doorbell rang twice. Pause. Twice again. Martin didn't jump this time. He didn't rush. He sat very still on the couch, the living room lamp off, the glow from the kitchen just enough to outline the space. The chef's knife rested beside his thigh. The camera feed glowed on his phone, the back door empty, the yard wet with rain. The bell rang again, not impatient, considerate. They knew he was awake. He stood slowly and crossed to the front window, careful to stay out of sight. Through the narrow gap in the curtain, he saw them. Not a crowd, not anything dramatic. Just Carol on the walkway, hands folded around a covered dish. George a few steps back, posture relaxed. Two other neighbors farther down the sidewalk, half visible under umbrellas, pretending not to watch. Carol smiled at the door, the way you smiled at someone in a hospital bed. "Martin," she called softly, "we know you're up." The words landed with terrible gentleness. Not an accusation, not a threat, an acknowledgement they were past pretense now. "We wanted to talk," she continued. "Just for a minute. You don't have to open the door if you're tired." Martin felt a strange clarity settle over him. Fear, yes, but also a sharpness he hadn't felt in months. This was the moment they'd been circling. The reason the power stayed on. The reason the house wouldn't sell. The reason kindness had started to feel like pressure. He thought of Helen, of her last clear protest, of how quickly it had been smoothed away. "I'm fine," he said, speaking through the door. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. "You should go home." There was a pause. Carol exchanged a glance with George, not surprised, just recalibrating. "We understand," Carol said. "Change is hard, especially after everything you've been through." Behind her, a porch light flicked on across the street. Another down the block, the neighborhood waking itself gently. "You don't have to be afraid," she added. "No one wants to hurt you." Martin almost laughed. The absurdity of it pressed against his ribs. "You killed my wife," he said. The word killed seemed to hang there, heavy, impolite. Carol didn't recoil, didn't deny it outright. Her smile thinned, became something sadder. "Helen was suffering," she said. "We all saw that, and so did you, even if you couldn't admit it at the time. That wasn't your decision." George stepped forward then, his voice calm, practiced. "Sometimes decisions don't belong to just one person. That's what community is for." Martin tightened his grip on the knife. On the camera feed, the backyard remained empty. They didn't need to sneak in, not tonight. "You can't make me," Martin said. Carol nodded slowly. "We'd rather you didn't see it that way." Silence stretched. Rain tapped softly against the porch railing. "We're patient," she said at last. "We've always been patient. But you're so tired, Martin. Anyone can see that. And winter took a lot out of you." Her eyes flicked just briefly toward the house behind him, measuring, assessing. "We can come back another night," she said gently. "Or you can invite us in now. Talk, eat something warm." Martin understood then that resistance wasn't a single act. It was endurance. And endurance was exactly what they were waiting to see him run out of. "No," he said, "go home." For the first time, Carol's smile slipped entirely. "That's all right," she said. "We'll check on you tomorrow." They didn't argue, they didn't push. Carol set the dish down on the step, careful not to let it tip, and stepped back. George followed. The others drifted away, one by one, lights dimming as quietly as they'd come on. The street returned to stillness. Martin waited a long time before moving. When he finally opened the door, the dish was still warm. He didn't touch it. He carried it to the trash and dumped it whole, ceramic cracking softly as it hit the bottom. That night he didn't sleep at all. At dawn, he made a decision not to flee, not to confront, but to outlast them. He began documenting everything. Dates, times, names, small details that didn't look like evidence yet but might someday. He sent copies to his daughter under mundane subject lines. Old tax records, scanned receipts, things that wouldn't raise questions. If something happened to him, she would have questions. And questions, he hoped, were contagious. The neighborhood remained kind, always kind, but something had shifted. The visits became more formal, the smiles more careful, the patience he sensed thinning. Mercy, after all, was only generous when it was accepted willingly. And Martin Ketch had decided, quietly, stubbornly, that he would not make it easy for them. She would tell people he'd been tired, that the winter had been hard, that grief had finally caught up with him. It would all sound reasonable when framed by people who spoke softly and shook their heads with practiced sorrow. The window slid open another inch. The sound was barely there, a whisper of movement, careful, respectful. Whoever it was didn't rush. They never rushed. Rushing was for accidents, for crimes. This was neither. Martin set the knife down on the counter. The decision once made brought an unexpected calm. Not peace. He knew better than to call it that, but a stillness, the way a storm paused at its center. Fighting had kept him awake for months, had sharpened every sound into threat. Letting go loosened something in his chest, even as it terrified him. The shadow eased through the laundry room window, shoes touching the floor without a sound. A man, he realized, older, familiar in outline, George perhaps, or someone George trusted, someone steady. "Martin," the voice whispered, gentle and relieved. "You don't need to be afraid." Martin didn't answer. He stood where he was, hands visible, empty. He wondered if this was how Helen had stood at the end, upright, cooperative, making it easier for everyone else to believe this was kindness. Another figure appeared behind the first, then another. They moved with the quiet coordination of people who had done this before, who knew the house, knew where the floor creaked and where it didn't. Someone turned on a small lamp, not the overhead light. Soft illumination, no harshness. Carol stepped into the kitchen last, carrying a small paper bag and a glass of water. "There you are," she said, as if she'd found him awake at the table after a long night. "We were worried." Martin met her eyes. "How long?" She didn't pretend not to understand. "Long enough," she said. "Long enough to know when someone needs help they can't ask for." She set the bag on the counter, slid it toward him. Inside, he knew, would be pills, or something dissolved already, measured, documented, humane. "We'll stay with you," she added. "You won't be alone." That, more than anything, almost broke him. The promise of witnesses, of company, of being seen to the end. Martin thought of the emails he'd scheduled, the documents sent under boring subject lines. Thought of the camera still quietly recording the back door, the laundry room, the kitchen. He wondered if anyone had noticed it yet. "Okay," he said. Carol exhaled, a breath she'd been holding. George moved closer, placing a hand lightly on Martin's shoulder, solid, reassuring. They guided him to the table. The chair scraped softly. Someone adjusted the light, the neighborhood closing in, not with force but with care. Martin wrapped his fingers around the glass. It trembled despite himself. As Carol reached into the bag, the camera in the corner clicked softly, its tiny red light steady, unblinking. Martin watched it for a long moment. Then he lifted the glass to his lips and wondered, briefly, fiercely, whether mercy, once documented, might finally lose its patience. Martin laughed then. It surprised all of them. It came out rough, a single bark of sound, but it was real. "Every family," he said, "except the ones who leave." Carol's hands paused over the counter, just for a fraction of a second. "Enough." "They don't leave," George said gently. "They move on." Martin nodded, as if accepting the correction. He glanced once more at the window, at the quiet street that had watched him age and grieve and weaken, at the houses that held people who knew his routines better than his own daughter did, a neighborhood that mistook familiarity for authority. "You should sit," Carol said. "This will go easier." "No," Martin replied. His voice was steadier now, clearer than it had been in months. Helen stood. That name hung in the air between them. Carol swallowed. Martin straightened, releasing the sink. His hands were empty, open, cooperative, the way they liked. "You're right about one thing," he said. "There was nowhere to go." George nodded, relief creeping into his posture. Acceptance always made things smoother. "But you were wrong about another." Carol frowned. "Martin." "You said no one would believe me," he continued. "That's not the same as no one would hear me." Carol's eyes flicked, just briefly, to the corner of the kitchen. The camera's red light blinked. Once, twice. George turned, following her gaze, his face drained of color. Martin felt something close to satisfaction. Not triumph, not safety, but the quiet dignity of having refused to disappear politely. "It's been recording since April," Martin said. "Back door, laundry window, tonight too, audio." Carol stepped back. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Martin said. "You've had decades because no one ever fought after they understood. They fought before, or they accepted." He reached into his pocket and set his phone on the counter, screen lit. A draft email open, multiple recipients, scheduled. "My daughter gets this at 6:00 a.m., he said. "So does a lawyer in Portland, and a journalist who likes stories about small towns that care too much." Silence. The neighborhood had never rehearsed this part. George's kindness curdled into something tight and frightening. "You'd destroy everything," he said. "You don't know what this place is without us." Martin met his eyes. "Then maybe it deserves to be destroyed." Carol's voice was small now. "You'll be alone again." Martin smiled, thinking of Helen. Not calm, not resigned, but stubborn, tired, and still choosing. "I already was," he said. "The difference is now you are too." Outside, somewhere down Oleander Drive, a door opened. A car engine started and stopped. Someone else had noticed the delay. Martin picked up his phone. "Please leave," he said politely, the way neighbors did, "while you still can." For the first time since Helen died, Martin watched them hesitate. Martin's mind kept circling the same numbers, like a prayer that had lost its meaning. 5 families, 4 decades, each one gone quietly, each one folded into polite explanations and tasteful funerals. He remembered the woman in Arizona, the way her voice had tightened when she realized he was still living there. He understood now that he was standing at the same invisible threshold they all had reached. "What if I say no?" he asked, even as the question collapsed under its own weight. Carol answered with a softness that felt practiced, almost loving. He wouldn't refuse, not really. He wasn't the kind of man who made things ugly. He cared about consequences, about how choices rippled outward, about his daughter already carrying too much grief. This path, she explained, spared everyone unnecessary pain. It was calm, respectful. Everything would be arranged. People would say kind things. No one would ever know he was afraid at the end. That was the cruelty of it. She wasn't lying. If he resisted, hands would hold him down with apologies. If he shouted, doors would stay closed or open only to people who already agreed. And even if, by some miracle, he escaped tonight, it would only delay the inevitable. Tomorrow, or next month, or next winter. The same faces would return, the same patience, the same certainty. A single man could not outlast a system designed to wait. Helen had learned that. He saw it now. She hadn't chosen peace because she wanted to die. She chose it because the alternative was terror without hope. At least this way, she had been allowed to believe she was cared for, that her ending meant something gentle, Martin's gaze drifted to the bag on the counter. Everything was prepared, labeled, measured, his life reduced to neat compartments and professional handwriting. There would be no questions afterward, just another sad story that made sense to everyone who heard it. A widower, depression, an unfortunate but understandable end. The house would sell quickly. A new family would arrive. They would praise the neighbors. They always did. George shifted his weight and asked, almost casually, whether Martin planned to resist. Not a threat, just logistics. Things went smoother if people cooperated. Martin thought about the knife close enough to touch, about the camera silently capturing every word, and he realized how fragile that hope was. Footage could be interpreted, context could be supplied. His daughter would watch it one day and see exactly what they wanted her to see. Concerned neighbors, medical supplies, a father who looked tired and confused, people helping. The truth did not matter if it could be framed. "I won't fight," Martin said. The words felt heavy but honest. Carol exhaled, relief spreading across her face like sunlight after rain. She told him he'd made the right choice, that this would be easy now. "Come sit," she said gently. "You'll just drift off." They guided him toward the living room, close but not touching, careful not to rush him. He lowered himself into Helen's chair. The fabric still remembered her shape. Carol set the bag beside him, her movements calm and assured. As she prepared, Martin stared ahead and thought of all the kitchens where this same decision had been made. All the people who had been told they were being spared suffering. All the quiet endings disguised as kindness. And he understood with devastating clarity that mercy was just another word for permission. He settled into the chair that had always belonged to Helen, though he had never said it aloud. Carol worked quietly, laying out what she needed with the calm confidence of routine. The living room glowed softly, suspended in a half-light. Holiday boxes stacked neatly by the mantel, decorations sealed away as if time itself had paused, unsure whether to move forward or retreat. Carol's eyes drifted across the room in a careful sweep. Then she saw it. The small lens in the corner, the faint red point of light. For an instant, something stirred in Martin's chest, an irrational spark, fragile and brief. Proof, witness, a final chance that this moment might escape the neat explanations waiting for it. Carol didn't flinch. She offered the camera a brief, solemn smile, the kind reserved for unavoidable things. Then she turned back to Martin and spoke gently, telling him it was all right. They had expected this. Of course he would try. The recording would capture everything and it would change nothing. It never did. His voice felt distant when he asked about Helen. Not how she died, but whether she had understood, whether she had truly known what was happening when the end came. Carol hesitated, just long enough for something real to cross her face. Not guilt, not fear, something closer to sorrow. She said Helen had understood, that she had thanked them, that she had said she was ready. Martin believed her. Helen had always faced hard truths without flinching. She would have weighed the options, seen the walls closing in, recognized which path spared the most pain. She would have chosen stillness over panic, grace over resistance. That was who she was. "Tell my daughter I love her," Martin said quietly. "Make sure she knows." Carol promised. She always did. The needle slid in. A cool sensation followed, spreading gently, as if mercy itself had a temperature. The edges of the room softened, shapes blurred. The weight he'd been carrying for months loosened its grip. Carol and George watched him closely, their faces calm, almost tender. Two people utterly certain of their purpose. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps mercy was simply the willingness to decide when others could not. As the darkness folded in, Martin thought of Helen sitting here before him, making the same surrender. They hadn't faded away on their own. They had been evaluated, agreed upon, chosen by consensus in the name of care. And in the end, he wondered if it mattered. The pain was gone. The waiting was over. The street outside would remain quiet and orderly. New people would arrive. The neighborhood would continue as it always had, watchful, attentive, devoted. That was how places like this survived. They took care of their own. Story 2, December, always arrived like a quiet promise, and Vera Moss felt it settle into the walls of her home long before the calendar confirmed it. By the third morning of the month, the house had already begun its gentle urging, small reminders, familiar expectations. December meant readiness. December meant her son was coming. She stood at the kitchen counter before sunrise, the room washed in gray light, scooping flour with a chipped blue measuring cup she'd owned longer than most people she knew. Her hands weren't unsteady exactly, just uncertain enough to send a pale cloud drifting onto the counter. It looked like snowfall. She brushed it away and kept going. 3 cups, that was the rule. Christmas cookies had rules. Gerald loved these cookies. He always had. Even when he was little, when his fingers pressed clumsy shapes into the dough and his laughter filled the room louder than the mixer ever could. She smiled at the memory, though it felt strangely distant, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Outside the window, her neighbor hauled a trash bin toward the curb. The woman glanced at Vera's house, then turned away too quickly. Vera noticed. People had been doing that more often lately, looking at her home as if it carried a draft, then pretending they hadn't looked at all. She didn't take offense. Age did that to people. You became something fragile in their minds, something best avoided, a reminder of endings. Let them avert their eyes. Vera had work to do. Cookies were just the beginning. There would be the slow-roasted beef on Christmas Eve, seasoned the way Gerald liked it, and the turkey the next day, stuffed and basted and watched carefully. He appreciated care. He always had. And the house, oh, the house needed to look right, welcoming, proper. She'd already brought the boxes down from the attic, though the memory of doing so slipped away when she tried to grasp it. The ornaments waited patiently in their thin paper sleeves. The good dishes sat stacked and ready for washing. The linen tablecloths needed pressing. The good ones. Gerald would notice if she used the everyday cloth. At some point, she found herself standing in the dining room, unsure how long she'd been there or how she'd arrived. That happened sometimes now. Little skips, little disappearances. The doctor had explained it with careful language and comforting smiles, but Vera didn't need labels. The house was large. It had corners where time could wander off if it wanted. The table stood beneath the chandelier, polished to a soft shine. She ran her fingers across it, relieved to find no dust. She must have cleaned it recently, or maybe earlier that morning. It didn't matter. It was clean now, and that was what counted. She laid out 2 place settings without thinking. The motion lived deep in her muscles. Plate, fork, knife, glass. Napkins folded just so. 1 seat at the head of the table, 1 to the right. That was how it had always been. Gerald would sit there. She could already picture it, his coat draped over the chair, his expression scanning the room, taking in the details. He noticed details. He always had. Vera stepped back and surveyed the table, her heart lifting with quiet satisfaction. Everything was coming together. December had begun, and the house was ready. Favorite soup. When Vera returned to the kitchen, A pot was already murmuring on the stove. She paused, puzzled, not alarmed, just mildly curious. She didn't remember turning on the burner or adding the ingredients, yet there it was, sending up the familiar, reassuring scent of chicken broth and herbs. Noodle soup, Gerald's favorite, the kind of meal that made even a mild winter day feel survivable. December in coastal California had a way of sneaking cold into the bones despite the sunshine. At exactly noon, she filled 2 bowls, careful not to spill a drop, and carried them to the dining room. Steam curled upward in soft white ribbons. She placed one bowl at her, setting the other at the chair to her right, then lowered herself into her seat and smoothed the napkin across her knees. The silence pressed gently around her. Vera looked at the empty chair and felt something shift inside her. Not grief, not clarity, just a subtle movement, like a house settling after a change in temperature. She lifted her spoon and ate with deliberate calm, each motion steady in practice. Across from her, the untouched soup slowly cooled. She watched the surface change, the warmth fatting, the broth growing still. When her bowl was empty, she rose, collected both dishes, and returned to the kitchen. The second bowl she tipped into the sink without ceremony. Then she washed them both, dried them, and placed them back where they belonged. This was how her afternoons unfolded now. Later, she found herself standing in Gerald's old bedroom. She didn't recall climbing the stairs, but the room greeted her as if she'd always been there. Everything was orderly, too orderly. The bed was made tight and sharp, the dresser bare except for a small wooden box she recognized instantly. Inside lay his cufflinks and the watch his father had given him years ago. She opened the box and touched the glass face, cool, solid, alive with motion. Outside, the daylight was thinning. The windows had turned reflective, offering her a stranger's face, older than she remembered, softer around the edges, eyes that didn't quite focus together. She turned away and closed the box. The watch continued ticking. If she listened closely, it almost sounded like movement elsewhere in the house. A quiet, measured rhythm, not alarming, just present. Then from downstairs came the unmistakable sound of the front door opening and closing. Vera froze, her hands resting on the box. She waited. So did the house. No footsteps followed. No voice called her name. Only the steady ticking, marking time with patient insistence. After a moment, she left the room and made her way down the stairs, gripping the railing as she went. The foyer stood empty. The front door was shut, the lock turned firmly in place, exactly as it should be. Vera stood there for a long moment, listening. December had only just begun. The lock was still fastened. Vera tested it once, then again, feeling the click travel through her fingers. She leaned toward the door and peered through the tiny glass lens. Oleander Street curved back at her in warped proportions. Mrs. Alvarez's been resting obediently by the curb. The Hernandez house glowing with early holiday lights, the pavement empty and calm. Everything looked exactly as it should. And yet the house felt unsettled. Not threatened, just altered, like air that had recently been disturbed by someone passing through it. She turned away and went back to the kitchen, determined not to linger on sensations that refused to explain themselves. Dinner needed deciding, not the roast that was reserved, sacred, meant for Christmas Eve. Tonight should be modest. She opened the refrigerator and stopped. Milk containers crowded the shelves, some fresh, others long past their usefulness. Eggs filled nearly an entire drawer. Vegetables sagged with age, an abundance that made no sense for one woman living alone. A quiet realization landed. She had been buying the same things over and over, each trip to the store erased by the next. The refrigerator wasn't storage anymore. It was evidence, a record of forgotten errands and repeated intentions. Vera closed the door slowly. Something wasn't right. It hadn't been right for some time. The wrongness hadn't arrived all at once. It had crept in gently, polite enough to be ignored. Like a noise behind the wall you promise yourself you'll investigate tomorrow. But Gerald would be home soon. That thought steadied her. December always brought him back, always had. The house only needed to be ready. She made herself a simple sandwich, peanut butter and jelly, the way she used to when Gerald was small and came home hungry from school. She ate it standing at the counter. When she finished, she made a second sandwich and set it neatly on a plate in the dining room, placing it at his usual seat. Then she moved to the living room and turned on the television. The images flickered. Voices rose and fell. None of it seemed to connect. It all washed over her, disconnected, like listening to a conversation through a closed door. At 10 o'clock, she returned to the dining room. The sandwich sat untouched, exactly where she'd left it. She wrapped it carefully and placed it in the refrigerator, wedging it between the milk jugs. Sleep came unevenly. She woke to movement. The clock glowed 2:47. Vera lay motionless, listening. Drawers slid open. Something shifted on the counter. The refrigerator door opened, closed. A floorboard near the sink complained softly, the same one that always did. Whoever was in her kitchen moved with ease. No hesitation, no searching. Relief spread through her chest. Gerald. Of course, he must have arrived late. He had always kept his key. She pressed it into his hand decades ago and told him this house would never stop being his. She waited for him to call her name. He didn't. The sounds continued, quiet, methodical, familiar in a way she couldn't quite place. After a while, they stopped. The house settled back into stillness. Vera lay there smiling faintly in the dark. December had finally begun properly. Her meal and waited a moment longer, as if politeness itself might summon him. When nothing happened, she rose and cleared the table. She hesitated at Gerald's plate, then carried it to the sink and scraped the food away. The sound of it, soft bread hitting porcelain, cheese sliding into the drain, felt louder than it should have. She washed the china carefully, drying each piece by hand before returning it to the cabinet. The afternoon passed much the same way the others had, marked by small, purposeful tasks. Laundry folded, counters wiped, a wreath adjusted on the front door so it hung perfectly straight. Outside, the light shifted and thinned, the day slipping quietly toward evening. She found herself back upstairs again without remembering the decision to go. Gerald's room waited, patient and unchanged. She sat on the edge of the bed this time, smoothing the blanket where he would have slept as a boy, listening to the house breathe around her. Somewhere deep inside the walls, pipes ticked softly, or perhaps it was something else. When dusk settled fully, she went downstairs and began preparing dinner. Pot roast, after all. Christmas was close enough to justify it. She set the oven, seasoned the meat the way she always had, careful not to forget the rosemary. Gerald liked rosemary. As the roast cooked, the familiar smell filled the house, rich and warm. Vera felt calmer then, steadied by routine, by tradition. This was how things were supposed to be. Families gathered. Sons came home. Mothers cooked. She set the table again, 2 places. Candles lit. The clock ticked on the wall, loud in the pauses between her movements. Halfway through carving the roast, she heard it. a chair scraping softly against the dining room floor. Vera's hand stilled. The knife hovered above the cutting board. Her breath caught, but she did not turn around. She didn't need to. Someone was sitting at the table. She carried the plates in with care, setting one in front of the empty chair, empty to the eye at least. She sat, folded her napkin, and began to eat. Across from her, the other plate steamed gently. She spoke then, her voice quiet but steady, the way it had always been when Gerald came home late. "You must be tired," she said. "You can eat as much as you like." The house listened. The candle flames trembled just slightly, as if stirred by a passing breath. Footsteps came. The house settled again, releasing a long, quiet breath. Vera remained on the floor for a long time, her fingers curled lightly around the edge of the ornament box. The angel lay where she had placed it, wings catching the fading light. She did not move to wrap it again. She did not trust her hands. Eventually, the cold crept up through her knees and reminded her of her body. She rose carefully, using the arm of the sofa for balance, and left the boxes where they were. Decorations could wait. Gerald would understand. He always had when he was in a good mood. Evening gathered itself outside the windows. The living room darkened until the photographs became pale shapes on the walls and the corners of the ceiling receded into shadow. Vera turned on the lamp beside Gerald's chair, the chair he had favored even as an adult, sitting stiffly, never fully at ease, and lowered herself into her own. She listened. The house made its small, familiar sounds. The tick of the clock, the whisper of air moving through the vents. Beneath it all, something else lingered, a sense of occupancy without presence, like a coat left on a hook after its owner has gone. She spoke without lifting her voice. "You can sleep in your old room," she said, staring at the darkened hallway. "I aired it out." The words felt right, necessary. Nothing answered her. At 9, she locked the front door. At 10, she checked it again. At 10:30, she stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked up, the banister rising into darkness. For a moment, she thought she saw movement there, a shape retreating just beyond the reach of the light. But when she blinked, it was only shadow folded into shadow. Her body knew when it was time for bed, even if her mind resisted. She climbed the stairs slowly, pausing at each step, listening for the sound of breathing that wasn't her own. Gerald's door stood open. His room was dark and quiet, untouched. In her bedroom, she lay down fully dressed, hands folded on her stomach the way her mother had taught her when sleep would not come. The ceiling loomed above her, unfamiliar in its angles. She watched it until her eyes burned. Sometime after midnight, the footsteps returned. They were closer this time, careful, respectful. They crossed the hallway and stopped just outside her door. Vera did not move, did not open her eyes. She felt the weight of attention settle on her, gentle but insistent, like a child standing beside a bed, waiting to be noticed. She smelled rosemary. A hand brushed the edge of the nightstand. The lightest touch, barely there. Then the sound of someone sitting in the chair by her window. Vera breathed in and out, slow and measured. This was what mothers did. They endured. They made space. They did not ask questions that might shatter what little peace remained. In the morning, she woke alone. The chair by the window was empty, but it had been moved closer to the bed. Downstairs, the front door was still locked, the kitchen unchanged, yet the glass angel sat on the dining table, upright and centered, as if someone had decided where it belonged. Vera smiled faintly. He was settling in. December, after all, was a time for preparation. Darkness, the single bare bulb at the bottom unlit. Cool air rose up to meet her, carrying the damp smell of earth and old cardboard and something faintly metallic. Vera stood at the top of the stairs for a long moment, her hand gripping the doorframe. "Gerald," she called softly. Her voice slipped down the stairwell and disappeared. The sound came again, closer now, clearer. A slow exhale, deliberate, patient. Vera took the first step, then another. Each stair creaked beneath her weight, the noise loud in the narrow space. She kept one hand on the wall, fingers brushing over peeling paint, the other clenched around the banister. Halfway down, the bulb flickered on by itself, bathing the basement in a weak yellow light. She stopped. At the bottom of the stairs, someone was standing. Not fully in the light, not fully in the dark. The shape was wrong in small ways, too still, too centered, as if it had been placed there rather than having arrived on its own. It wore Gerald's jacket, the brown one she'd bought him after college, the one he'd left behind the last time he came home. The shoulders were filled out now, broader than she remembered, but the sleeves hung just a little too long. "Mom," it said. The voice was his, almost, familiar in the way an old recording is familiar, flattened and hollowed by time. Vera felt something in her chest finally give way. Relief rushed in so fast it made her dizzy. "I knew you'd come," she said, tears blurring her vision. "I've been getting ready. I made dinner. I kept your room just the way you like it." The figure shifted forward, into the light. Its face was Gerald's face, arranged carefully, lovingly, but the eyes were wrong. They reflected the bulb too brightly, like glass marbles. They did not blink. "You've been waiting a long time," it said. "Yes," Vera whispered, "but that's all right." She stepped off the last stair. Behind the figure, she saw what it had been standing in front of. Boxes stacked against the far wall, some collapsed with age, others newly opened. Their contents lay scattered across the floor: photographs, old clothes, school papers, Christmas decorations still wrapped in yellowing tissue. Her life, sorted and unsorted, pulled apart by careful hands. "You shouldn't be alone anymore," it said gently. Vera nodded. That made sense. Everything about this made sense now. The footsteps, the rearranged cups, the sense of being watched with concern rather than threat. Gerald had come back because she needed him, because mothers were not meant to be forgotten in houses that grew too large around them. She reached out. The air between them felt cold and thick, like water before a storm. Her fingers brushed his sleeve. The fabric was real, solid. "Let's go upstairs," she said. "It's almost Christmas." The thing wearing her son smiled. And somewhere above them, in the quiet house on Oleander Street, the clock kept ticking, steady and patient, counting down the last days of December. Was gone. The hallway was empty, the doors closed, the air still. She stopped questioning it. Questioning required energy, and energy was becoming hard to come by. What mattered was that Gerald was here. What mattered was that the house no longer felt quite so hollow. The waiting had eased, replaced by a presence that moved through the rooms with quiet certainty. She cooked more now, full meals, left plates out overnight. Sometimes they were untouched in the morning. Sometimes they were gone, scraped clean and stacked neatly in the sink the way Gerald used to do when he wanted to prove he was grown. She took these small signs as reassurance, proof that she hadn't imagined him into being. The basement door remained closed. She avoided the kitchen when she could, taking her coffee into the living room, her meals at the dining table with her back carefully turned away from the hallway. Whatever was below stayed below. Whatever was above stayed close. On December 18th, she found the Christmas tree already standing in the living room. She stared at it for a long time, her mind slow to accept what her eyes were telling her. It was the old artificial tree, the one Gerald had helped her assemble every year since he was tall enough to reach the middle branches. The box was gone. The tree stood straight and centered, its metal trunk locked into place. It wasn't decorated. Not yet, Vera murmured, her voice trembling with relief. That's all right, we'll do it together. That night, she heard the basement again. Not the single thump from before, but movement, a dragging sound. Slow, heavy, deliberate. It went on for several minutes, then stopped. She sat very still in her chair, hands folded, eyes fixed on the dark television screen reflecting her own pale face. She did not turn around. She did not look toward the kitchen. She told herself this was how families worked. Everyone had their spaces. Everyone did their part. On December 21st, Gerald spoke to her. Not from another room, not through the walls. He spoke from just behind her. You don't have to be afraid, he said. Her breath caught painfully in her throat. She didn't turn. She was afraid that if she did, the spell would break, that the careful balance she built, above and below, past and present, would collapse. I'm not, she whispered. I'm just tired. I know. The word carried weight, understanding. She felt it settle into her bones. You've been taking care of everything, he continued. You shouldn't have to do that alone anymore. Tears slipped down her cheeks. She nodded. On Christmas Eve, the basement door was open. Vera stood at the edge of the kitchen, staring at the dark rectangle where the door should have been closed. Cold air seeped upward, carrying that same damp earthen smell, stronger now, familiar. Gerald, she called. He answered from downstairs. I'm here. She took the first step without thinking. The bulb at the bottom of the stairs was on, casting long shadows up the walls. The basement looked different now, cleaner, organized. The boxes were stacked neatly. The washer and dryer were silent. The air felt expectant. He stood near the far wall, waiting. She descended slowly, carefully, each step steady despite the pounding of her heart. You're almost ready, he said, smiling in that careful way that showed too many teeth. You just need to rest. She felt suddenly very old, very tired. That sounds nice, she said. Behind him, the shadows seemed to shift, to gather closer, as if the basement itself were leaning in to listen. Vera stepped off the last stair. Upstairs, the house on Oleander Street stood quiet and orderly, decorated for Christmas at last. The lights on the tree glowed softly in the living room window, a comforting sight for anyone passing by. Inside, the house took care of its own, all the way to the end. Floorboards creaked softly under her feet, but no one was there. The air smelled faintly of soap and something else she couldn't name, something human and familiar like a shadow of him. Vera pressed her hand to her chest, trying to slow her racing heartbeat. Her son was here, yet not here. The sobs had been real, yet belonged to no one she could see. She stepped further into the room, her fingers brushing the quilt Gerald had left behind, smooth from years of careful folding. The wooden box on the dresser caught her eye. She opened it, and the watch ticked steadily inside. Tick, tick, tick. She held it close, listening, imagining the small footsteps that had walked these floors not long ago. A shiver ran down her spine as the sense of presence deepened. Gerald had been here. She knew it with a certainty that had nothing to do with sight. Something intangible lingered, his weight, his rhythm. the echo of his being imprinted on the air. Vera sank into the chair by the window, hands folded tightly, and let herself breathe. The house felt alive in a way it hadn't for years. Every creak, every draft, every whisper of wind against the windows carried him, carried memory, carried something that was almost enough. The kitchen, the dining room, the narrow stairs, they were all extensions of him, and now they belonged to both of them again, if only in shadow and echo. Outside, the street was quiet. The lights of neighboring houses flickered in the gray afternoon. Vera stared at the empty chair at the table, the untouched plates, the good china shining under the dim light. She smiled faintly, a small, fragile acknowledgement of the impossible, that her son was home, even when he was not. And for the first time in years, she let herself hope that the house on Oleander Street was not just waiting for December anymore. It was awake, it was alive, and somehow it was keeping them together. The wooden box on the dresser sat closed, but the watch inside had grown impossibly loud, each tick reverberating like a pulse against her chest. Tick, 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 like someone or something was trying to escape time itself. The sobs she had heard the night before had vanished, leaving a heavy silence that pressed into the room. Vera eased herself onto the edge of Gerald's bed. The bedspread was rough beneath her fingers, dust clinging like old snow. When had anyone lain here last? A shadow of memory clawed its way to the surface, dark and unyielding, but she shoved it back down. Not yet. Not until he came home. Not until Christmas. And Christmas was only 5 days away. She could feel it. The house itself seemed to tighten around her, the air thicker, the ceilings pressing low, the walls leaning in like they were listening. That night she woke to movement she couldn't ignore. Gerald was there. She couldn't see his face, the darkness swallowed it whole. But she knew the outline of him, the slight tilt of his head he had carried since childhood, the steady set of his shoulders. He watched her, silent and still. Vera opened her mouth, but sound failed her. Her tongue was heavy, her throat locked in ice. She could do nothing but lie there and feel the impossible certainty of his presence. They remained in that suspended, wordless moment until he turned and moved, footsteps echoing down the stairs, across the living room, toward the basement. The basement door thudded shut behind him. Morning arrived with a cold, gray light, and Vera's left arm hung useless at her side. Pain shot through her shoulder like lightning whenever she moved it. She dressed herself by biting down on the fabric, gripping the railing with her right hand as she descended. Dr. Brennan's number stared back at her from the refrigerator, held in place by the strawberry magnet, but she didn't call. Gerald would be home in 4 days. 4 days. She could endure 4 days. She set the table alone, right hand only, arranging the fine china with trembling precision. She heated chicken noodle soup, his favorite, and ladled it into bowls despite the screaming pain in her shoulder. She sat down and began to eat. Across from her, Gerald's bowl sat untouched, steam rising in perfect spirals. But something had shifted. Today she noticed small, uncanny details she had never seen before. The wallpaper curling near the ceiling, the chandelier's crystals catching light like a prism of memories, the faint outline of footprints in the dust along the hallway. The house had changed, or perhaps she had changed. She felt it in her bones, the subtle electricity of a presence she couldn't see, a weight hovering just beyond the edge of her vision. The minutes stretched and contracted, and the ordinary sounds of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of the floorboards, became alive, deliberate, like whispers. Vera's heart hammered. She wasn't imagining him. He had been here, he was still here, moving through her home with the silent assurance of someone returning to what was theirs. And somewhere deep inside, she understood. This was more than memory, more than longing. Gerald had returned in a way she could neither explain nor resist. The house, the air, the walls themselves had aligned to herald it. And for the first time in years, Vera felt that impossible, trembling hope. That he was home, that he had always been home, and that Christmas, whatever it might bring, would not come without him. Faded marker, a single word written in Gerald's precise hand. Return. Vera froze at the edge of the pile, breath catching in her throat. Her heart hammered so loudly she thought it might echo through the concrete walls. Slowly she reached for the box, fingers trembling, and lifted the lid. Inside, everything was meticulous. A folded sweater she remembered buying him for his first Christmas away at college, a stack of letters tied with a ribbon, and a small leather-bound journal. The journal wasn't like any she had seen before. Its cover was worn but cared for, and when she opened it, the pages were filled with neat handwriting, words looping and curling in ways that made her chest ache. She flipped through, and there it was, Gerald, recounting his days, his fears, his longing for home, his love for her. The words struck her like a sudden storm. I've never forgotten the way you make this house a home. I'll be back. I'll come home this December. The air in the basement shifted. Vera could feel it, the tension she had ignored for weeks, the quiet that had stretched between her and the house, now filling with movement she couldn't see. The boxes shifted ever so slightly, though she had not touched them. A whisper of air, a shadow across the wall. She wasn't alone. Vera swallowed hard and rose, the journal clutched to her chest. The basement stairs seemed longer on the way up, the light flickering just enough to make the shadows dance. She emerged into the kitchen and paused, feeling the presence she had been sensing all December. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't her imagination. Gerald had been here in his own way. Somewhere, somehow, he had returned. She moved through the house, checking each room with deliberate care. The dining table, the chairs, the photographs on the wall, they all felt different, softened by memory and presence. And in the living room, she paused by the Christmas boxes, the ornaments waiting to be hung. She lifted the tissue paper from a delicate glass angel, its painted wings gleaming faintly in the overhead light, and felt the tremor in her hand's ease. Vera realized something she had not allowed herself to believe. Gerald's return wasn't a thing she could see or touch, not fully. It was the house remembering him, the floors remembering his steps, the air carrying the weight of his life through every room. The past and present had collided, and for a moment, everything made sense. She set the angel carefully aside, whispered his name into the empty house, and for the first time that December, the house felt alive with him. The basement, the kitchen, the hallways, all of it seemed to breathe, a quiet acknowledgement of homecoming. And Vera understood with a sudden shivering clarity that Gerald had come back, not as a figure in the flesh, but as the soul of the house itself, walking quietly, watching, waiting, and keeping her company through the long days until Christmas. The box sat heavy before her, edges worn, flaps folded like silent warnings. Vera's hands hovered, reluctant but drawn. She knew, always had. Deep down, she had known what waited inside. Footsteps echoed above, measured, familiar, packing the kitchen. Gerald, back and forth, the restless rhythm of anger and frustration, the same way he had when words failed him. She lifted the flaps with trembling fingers. The smell hit first, dust, damp earth, a metallic tang beneath it all. Her stomach churned, but curiosity overrode fear. Her fingers met fabric stiff, wrong, and then something cold and smooth. Glass, cracked, fractured glass, circular like a watch face. Memory slammed into her with the force of a storm. Thanksgiving night, voices raised, fury spilling from both of them. The poker in her hand, the impact, Gerald falling. Blood spreading across the foyer carpet, soaking into everything it touched. Vera recoiled, pulling her hand back, and with it the watch. its face fractured like a spider's web, hands frozen at 11:47. She had placed it upstairs herself, checked it. How could it have ended up here, lying among the forgotten things? She dropped it. Heart hammering, she plunged her hand back into the box, drawn by a compulsion she could not resist. Slick plastic met her fingertips. A bag. Light now, but wrong in shape, wrong in presence. Above, the footsteps had stopped. The house held its breath. Vera gripped the bag, and the memories she had buried for decades surged through her, raw and unrelenting. 20 years, 30. Time had dissolved in this lonely house. In a life spent setting a place for a son who would never grow older than 26, preparing meals for a boy who had stopped existing. The argument returned. Thanksgiving, not Christmas. She remembered now, his voice sharp, her own rising in response. Words that cut deeper than knives, a disagreement over someone she never approved of. And then the turning point. Gerald had moved toward the door, and the poker had been in her hands, heavy, cold, a desperate attempt to stop him, to make him listen. She had swung. The sound of it, a wet breaking branch. He collapsed, eyes wide, empty, chest rising once, twice, then still. She had killed her son, and what came next? Fuzzy memories, blurred by time or mercy, dragging him down the stairs, the heavy thump of his heels, placing him in the box, sealing the bag, her own handwriting on the side. Gerald's things. Do not open. Then the mind's protective veil, the forgetting, the pretending, the slow erasure of unbearable truth. But Gerald had not forgotten. He had never left. In the basement, in the box, in the shadows of memory, he waited. And every year, as the calendar edged toward Thanksgiving, toward the anniversary, he returned, walking through the halls, adjusting cups, packing the kitchen, standing silently at the foot of her bed, watching her sleep. Each year she forgot again, a dementia the doctors would name, a sickness she would believe. But it was not sickness, it was mercy. The only mercy her mind could grant, shielding her from the relentless, shattering weight of the truth, that her son's presence had never left, that he would always come back, and she would always, painfully, forget. The warning was written in her own slanted script, faded but unmistakable. Do not open. Vera stood in the basement, staring at the old box, her heart thudding as if it already knew the truth her mind refused to name. The lid wasn't locked. It never had been. Just folded cardboard, patient, waiting. One small movement of her hand and the past would spill out. She hesitated, listening. Footsteps above her head. Slow, measured, crossing the kitchen floor again and again, the way he used to walk when anger simmered but hadn't yet found its voice. That familiar rhythm tightened her chest. She raised her hand anyway and peeled the flaps apart. The smell reached her first. Dry earth, dust, and beneath it a faint metallic bitterness that time had dulled but never erased. Her stomach lurched. Before she could pull back, her fingers moved on their own, brushing against cloth gone rigid with age, then something smooth and cold. Glass. Broken glass. Her fingertips traced a circular fracture the size of a watch face, and the memory detonated inside her. Thanksgiving night. Voices raised, faces twisted, the weight of iron in her hand. The sound, God, the sound, like something snapping that should never break. Eyes wide, then empty. Blood spreading across carpet as she dragged him step by step down into the dark. Kneeling on cold concrete, rapping, sealing, writing the words with shaking hands. She jerked her arm back as if burned. The watch came with it, clutched tight. Its crystal was spiderweb, the hands frozen at 11:47. She stared at it, confusion blooming into horror. She had seen this watch upstairs, touched it, spoken to it, or had she? The watch slipped from her fingers and clattered across the floor. Her hand plunged back into the box, compelled by something deeper than thought. She found plastic slick, folded, sealed. A garbage bag. Light now, but still wrong. The shape inside it unmistakable. Above her, the footsteps stopped. The house went still, as if holding its breath. Vera stood there with the bag in her hands, and the crack in her mind split open. Memories poured through, years collapsing into nothing. Decades alone in this house, setting an extra place at the table, cooking for a son who never grew older than 26. The argument, not Christmas, Thanksgiving. A girlfriend she didn't approve of. Small words that turned sharp. He turned toward the door. She grabbed the poker, heavy and cold. She'd only wanted him to listen. He'd spun around. Then the floor, the blood, waiting for him to move. Watching his chest rise twice more and stop. She killed her son. The rest returned in fragments, dragging him downstairs, the box, the bag, the warning written like a prayer. And then the forgetting, or the mercy of it, because remembering would have destroyed her. But he hadn't forgotten. Every year as the anniversary crept closer, he walked the house, moved her things, watched her sleep, and every year she forgot again. The doctor had called it illness, but it wasn't sickness. It was survival. This year it failed. The lights went out. Darkness swallowed the basement. Vera froze, clutching the bag, when she heard movement on the stairs. Slow steps, careful, the way he'd come down as a boy, counting each tread in the dark. The steps reached the bottom and stopped. The air grew colder. That smell again, soap and something buried too long. Breathing not hers. Close. Then a voice unchanged by time. You're remembering. Her legs gave way. She hit the concrete hard, her useless arm trapped beneath her, the cold seeping into her bones. She tried to speak. Only a whimper escaped. The presence loomed over her. Every year you forget, the voice said calmly. Every year I make sure you do, but now you're too old, too weak. It won't work anymore. Her lips trembled. I'm sorry. A short, bitter laugh answered her. Now you are, 32 years later. You didn't mean to kill me, but you did, because I wouldn't obey, wouldn't be what you wanted. Tears streamed down her face. Please. Please what? The voice circled her in the dark. Please forgive you. Please let you hide again. You can't. You're remembering everything now, and you can't live with it. Silence pressed in. Then softly, I died at 11:47, Thanksgiving night. You watched it happen. You locked me away and pretended I was still coming home. Her sobs echoed off the concrete walls. I am home, the voice said gently. I never left. The lights snapped back on. Vera squeezed her eyes shut, then opened them. He stood there exactly as she remembered him, young, whole, watching her with eyes that held no warmth at all. And for the first time in decades, she remembered everything. The figure emerged from the shadows, pulling itself from the box like smoke made flesh. The dark shirt clung to a form that was horrifyingly familiar, his face pale, marred by the hollow dent above his right temple, the ghost of the poker's strike still carved into bone. His eyes, not empty, not dead, but burning with decades of silent fury. 3 decades. They followed her every twitch, every breath, every heartbeat that dared echo in the cold basement. He crouched close, close enough that her breath caught, close enough to feel the heat that wasn't there. And yet up close, he wavered, edges shimmering and blending with the shadows. The water heater behind him bled through his form, like reality itself couldn't hold him solid. Every Christmas, he murmured, voice low and soft, almost intimate, I let you forget. I let you set the table. I let you cook. I let you pretend I was coming home. It seemed kinder. Vera's chest heaved. Her whisper came out jagged. But what do you want from me? He tilted his head, that same infuriating childhood gesture, but twisted now, broken. Light struck the depression in his skull and she flinched. "I want you to remember," he said. "Everything, every moment, every choice, every second of that night. No mercy, no forgetting, no kindness." He rose, moving toward the stairs, slow and deliberate, the shadow of him stretching across the concrete floor. Then he paused, head cocked as though mocking the mother who had survived by pretending. "Merry Christmas, Mother." And he was gone. Vera lay on the concrete, the garbage bag still clutched in her trembling hands. The floodgates of memory opened, and the past crashed into her with brutal clarity. The sound of the poker hitting bone, Gerald's eyes widening in disbelief, the blood spreading across the foyer carpet, dragging him down the stairs. The weight of his body, the limpness. The years of pretending afterward, cooking his meals, setting his place, talking to him as if he had never left, as if she could somehow keep him alive with ritual. Had she known? Had she truly forgotten, or had she buried the truth beneath decades of performance? It didn't matter now. She remembered. She would remember until her dying breath. Her body was failing. The left side hung useless, dragging behind her as if it no longer belonged to her. Stroke, exhaustion, guilt, every burden converged. She clung to the wall, to the railing, to whatever fragments of strength remained, and began the impossible climb. Step by excruciating step, she hauled herself upward, her good arm straining, dragging her dead side behind her. The stairs loomed like mountains, mocking, relentless, but she had to rise. She had to leave the basement where her son had lain hidden, unremembered for 32 years. And with each movement, each shuddering step, the truth sank deeper into her bones. She could never undo this. She could only live with it, haunted by every memory, every stolen moment, every quiet year spent in a house full of ghosts she had called her family. She stopped halfway up the stairs, pressed against the wall, lungs burning as if the air itself had turned thick. Her fingers were empty now. Somewhere below, the bag lay abandoned on the concrete, along with the watch, the shirt, the truth she had finally pulled into the light. A part of her whispered that she should go back, gather it all, hide it again, restore the lie. But her legs trembled violently. She could barely stay upright. Turning around wasn't an option. When she reached the top, she spilled into the kitchen like a survivor crawling from wreckage. Morning sunlight poured through the windows, painfully bright. The microwave clock glowed. 8:15 a.m. December 21st. 4 days left. She dragged herself forward through the kitchen, past the foyer, into the living room. Everywhere she looked, the house betrayed her. The patch of carpet that didn't quite match the rest. The faint gouge near the fireplace where metal had scraped brick. The small table where she had stood frozen for half an hour, phone in hand, unable to call for help, unable to admit what she'd done. Her strength gave out. She fell into the chair and stayed there, eyes unfocused. Outside, life went on. A neighbor's door opened. Tires whispered past on the street. Ordinary sounds from a world that had no idea she was sitting in the wreckage of her own history. The hours slipped by unnoticed. She didn't eat. She didn't move. The numbness on her left side didn't fade, it spread. Slowly, relentlessly, her right side began to follow. At dusk, he appeared. Gerald stood in the doorway, half-lit by the dying day. His head was angled slightly, the hollow in his skull deepened by shadow. He said nothing. He didn't have to. They both understood. This was the end. Her body was shutting down piece by piece, the price finally coming due. She tried to speak, tried to force the words out. Sorry, I'm sorry. Her mouth twitched uselessly. Sound refused to come. An apology she realized too late was worthless now. Gerald watched her for a long, silent moment. Then he turned away. She heard his steps climbing the stairs, steady and familiar. She heard movement above her, drawers opening, closing, like he was searching through a life that had ended before it was finished. Darkness settled fully over the living room. Vera remained in her chair, trapped inside her failing body, unable to call for help, unable even to turn her head. The house grew quiet again, and this time there was no forgetting to save her. Her breaths came thin and uneven now, each one a struggle she wasn't sure was worth winning. Somewhere in the darkened house, Gerald was moving. She could hear him drifting from room to room, the kitchen, the dining area, the stairwell, retracing paths he'd worn into the house decades ago, filling spaces that had never truly been empty. She had wished for him to come home for the holidays, and now he had. At midnight, a sound rose from below, a slow scrape against concrete, something heavy being pulled, then footsteps on the stairs, careful and strained, like someone lifting a burden they'd carried for far too long. Gerald appeared from the basement, cradling the box in his arms. He carried it into the foyer and placed it gently at the center of the floor, right where he had collapsed all those years ago, right where the carpet had once been soaked and later replaced. He straightened and looked at her. Even in the dim light leaking through the curtains, she could see his eyes, calm, patient, certain. Understanding settled over her like a final weight. He wasn't hiding it anymore. He was leaving it to be found. When a neighbor finally checked on her, when the mail stacked too high, when the smell betrayed the house, however it happened, someone would come inside. Someone would see the box. Someone would open it. Gerald gave a small nod, as if acknowledging that she finally understood. Then he sat beside the box, folding his legs beneath him like a child on the floor, and waited. Her vision blurred. The numbness climbed into her chest, making every breath an act of will. Her heart fluttered weakly, unevenly. The room dimmed, or maybe her eyes were failing. She couldn't tell anymore. Gerald became less a figure and more a shape, darker than the surrounding dark, unmoving and patient. Her final thought drifted through her fatting mind. She had been right about one thing. Gerald did come home for Christmas. He had come home every year. She had just never understood why. Her breathing stopped at 2:47 a.m. on December 22nd. The house remained silent. 2 days later, Mrs. Alvarez noticed the newspapers piling up. On the fourth day, she called the authorities. On the fifth, the door was forced open. They found Vera in her chair, long dead, her body twisted by the stroke that had finally finished its work. They found spoiled food in the refrigerator, dates stretching back months. They found the dining table set for two, fine dishes laid out, candles burned to their ends. And in the foyer they found a box. The officer who opened it would later say it was the worst thing he'd seen in his career. The detective asked to be transferred. The medical examiner retired not long after. The story assembled itself from fragments: a watch frozen at 11:47, an old newspaper clipping about a young man who vanished decades ago, bones sealed in plastic, a basement floor stained beyond cleaning, a bedroom upstairs untouched, dusty, frozen in time. What they never found was a reason. The neighbor spoke of holiday meals cooked for two, of a mother who spoke often of her son coming home, of how easy it had been to mistake horror for loneliness. The house stood empty for months. When it finally sold, it went cheap. Everyone nearby knew its history. The new owners arrived in early autumn. They painted, remodeled, tore out carpets, replaced lights. The basement boxes went to the trash. A gym took their place. The house became modern, clean, new. On December 1st, the wife set the table for 3. She couldn't explain why. It just felt necessary. Someone else was coming. She was sure of it. On December 10th, they heard footsteps at night, slow packing overhead. On December 15th, every cup in the cupboard faced the same direction. On December 20th, they woke to the sound of a man crying in the basement, low, broken sobs that lasted until morning. By December 22nd, their bags were packed. By December 23rd, the house was empty again. The table remained set. The table stayed set for 3. The house on Oleander Street held its breath. Christmas passed without celebration, without warmth. Soon after, the sign appeared on the lawn once more, quietly offering the place to anyone who didn't know its history or chose not to believe it. Down in the basement, the marks never truly disappeared. No amount of paint or renovation could erase the faint shadows on the concrete, or the chill that lingered where something terrible had rested for far too long. The air there always felt heavier, as if it remembered. And if you stood very still on a winter night, when the world outside had gone silent, you might hear it. Soft footsteps moving back and forth, back and forth. The restless rhythm of someone who never left. Someone waiting. Waiting for a place at the table that will never be filled. Waiting for words that arrived decades too late. Waiting for a holiday that no longer belongs to this house. Because on Oleander Street, Christmas doesn't come anymore.